typical class, like procedural or? All right, so welcome. Right now we're going to talk about the last part of lecture 1. Oh, one more procedural thing. I'll post the full lecture, like everything on my slides, after that lecture is done. So what I mean by that is I didn't post it Friday because I was still finishing the last slides. So I'll be posting that at the end of today. Okay. So we're going to be talking about now basically reduction potential. So last lecture we talked about free energy, and we talked about phosphoryl transfer, which you can see up there. And so I guess I'll use this again. So an organism couples electron flow to biological function, and then you always need a donor and an acceptor. And an analogy for this is like battery-like circuits, right, where you have electrons moving in a circuit. The one that we're going to be focusing on for the next couple lectures is actually glucose going to CO2, water, and energy. And we're going to go into a lot of details. So within this reaction, you actually have phosphoryl transfer, and you also have electron transfer. And as you're going to see, and if you have read ahead, you'll see that it's not just, of course, one reaction, but many reactions with this final overall equation. So what is reduction potential? So it's the measured affinity of electron acceptors for electrons, and the units are V or volts. So the stronger the tendency to gain the electron, the more positive, and that's the more positive the acceptor. Okay. So by convention, it's just like the delta G free energy. Do you think I should turn this light down up here? I don't even know if I know how. Does someone else know how? Sorry. Do you see where? You think it should be up here? If anyone knows this room, otherwise I'll figure it out later because I don't want to take time. So basically, by convention, it's just like the delta G, right? There's a convention, and the convention is the standard, right, which is 25 degrees Celsius and 1 molar. And the convention, again, is at pH 0, because these conventions were made by chemists. But we are talking about biochemistry, and so most of what we do is going to be at pH 7. And at pH 7, so the reference is always the hydrogen electrode, so H plus 2 electrons going to H2. So at pH 0, right, which you really never see in biology, that's 0 volts, but at pH 7 it's minus 0.414. So this is really the standard from which we compare things. So how do you actually figure out the electron? Like, this is actually what chemists did to make the table in your book, is they took that standard. Again, I've talked about the language of chemistry and biochemistry. We have to have a way for people all over the world to compare things. So they set the H2, the hydrogen electrode, as the standard for biology at pH 7, and then they compare everything to that. So what you do is you have your hydrogen electrode here under standard conditions, and then you put whatever else your other pair we'll look at in a minute here, and then you basically see which way the electron goes, the voltage goes, and by how much. And so if it's going in this direction, the E is positive, and if it's going in this direction, it's negative. So the cell that gains electrons has positive. We're going to look at the table to give you more insight into that. So here is actually just a few examples before we look at the full table. So here's our standard for biology of 2H plus going to hydrogen, and that's minus 0.414. So you can see that everything else, right, is more positive, right? Minus 0.32, minus 0.21, and then going all the way up to O2 going to H2O. When we talk about photosynthesis, you'll see how unusual and how much of a change you can get in terms of a delta E for using oxygen converting to water as your electron acceptor. So because biological systems don't have a hydrogen electron sitting in there to compare it to, you always have two half reactions to be combined. So when you look at this table, I just took a picture of it, but you might even want to take a picture of it. This will be posted because you're going to be using it for your homework problems. But I also think it's a good way to think about it, right? So at the bottom, you have the most negative, right? And then as you go up, it's more positive, all the way up to water. And by convention, it's always written in the same direction where the electrons are on this side. So if you think about it, right, here, this is a really good electron donor, and the ones at the top are really good electron acceptors. So you're always going from electrons from here, going all the way up to the top. So in your table, I would actually, this is from my book. I actually would write this for myself. So I would write this for yourself. It's a great check to make sure you understand what's happening, and we're always thinking about which would be the electron donor and which would be the electron acceptor. So delta G, right? There's a relationship between delta G and delta E. And this relationship is listed here, where delta G is minus NF delta E. So F is a constant, Faraday's constant, and you will always be given constants. I don't really care about you memorizing them. If you, over time, one does get to know them by heart, but it's not a prerequisite for the course. N is the number of electrons, because we care, right? How many electrons are being transferred? And then delta E0 prime is that change in electron potential or reduction potential. So in every case, you would really want to highlight this. It's the change from the acceptor minus the donor. And the reason it's written by convention that way, we'll go through the example, is that you always have it written this way, right? So because it's always written in one direction, you actually have to do the negative of the donor. Okay, so we're going to go through this. So delta G0 is equal to minus NF, E acceptor minus E donor. So if you had this equation right here, right, acceptor minus donor, you would want to look up your acceptor, right? And then you want to look up your donor. So in this case, right, we have 0.82 for the acceptor, right, which is oxygen. So if we go back to the table, we can look at oxygen as the acceptor, minus that of the donor, right, which is the NADH. So let's go back to the table. So here, right, we have the acceptor, right, minus the donor. And then you just plug them in. So you just want to make sure you're in the right units, but the units are pretty consistent throughout. Kilojoules per mole is your final. So this reaction is favorable, right? It's a negative value. It's actually quite high, and you would expect energy to be made that's driven by electron delta E, right? So just like we talked about, we first talked about delta G prime and then delta G0 prime. I just wanted to spend 1 minute on this here for E. So E0 prime assumes that the concentrations are 1 molar, and that's from the redox pair. But if the concentrations are different, then you have to calculate them, just like you did for delta G, okay? So here you have E0 prime, so E, the actual difference, the actual electron potential, is equal to E0 prime plus R, the gas constant, T, temperature in Kelvin, and the number of electrons, F, Faraday's constant. Natural log of the acceptor over the donor at pH 7. So the table I showed you again is at pH 7, so you'd be able to pull in the information that you want. And really, what you need to know is in the cell, what is the concentration of your acceptor and your donor. So you're going to have problems they're already assigned at the end of this lecture that have you do these calculations. There'll definitely be these types of calculations on your exam, and all you have to do is practice them. So for each lecture, or combination of a couple lectures per topic, I'll have study aids. So this is what you want to know. You want to know these definitions: autotrophs, heterotrophs, anabolism, and catabolism. You want to recognize the structure of ATP, and then basically the phosphoryl transfers, one phosphate group, the pyrophosphate removal. I'm not going to focus on the adenosine transfer. You want to be able to recognize the structures of NAD, NADP, and FAD, and write the oxidized and reduced forms. So some of this, right, is memorization. So you just want to start now. Then these things you'll really need to know. How do you calculate delta G0 prime if given K equilibrium? How to calculate delta G prime if given the concentration of reactants? How does ATP drive thermodynamically unfavorable reactions, right, by coupling phosphoryl transfer to the other reaction, which we'll see with glycolysis? And then again, how to calculate delta G if given delta E. Okay? So work through these problems, ask your GSIs if you have any questions, and you can also come to my office hours. And your GSIs can also give you additional questions similar. So because this was originally from the first lecture, I had good luck as the final slide. So I'm sure you're all going to do really well. So the next lecture is actually moving into glycolysis.
Are we at to buy it this time?
What?
She's only
I'm going to do
updated
something
for
before, so this is just a similar,
lectures.
what I've said
Should put
before. So I'm going to get offline for a second to show you what this is. Has anyone ever played with this? So this is called KEGG, Kyoto Encyclopedia of Genes and Genomes. And actually in my lab we use this all the time. And many labs on campus and all over the world, we use this all the time. This was first developed by a Japanese group, Kanekisha's group, quite a number of years ago. So I'm going to get out of this for a second to show you how to look at this. So basically, if you go into your browser and you type in KEGG, so I guess I can start from the beginning for all of you. So these are the ways that I hope to get you to love metabolism. So Kyoto Encyclopedia of Genes and Genomes, so you click on that.
It's not.
Oh shoot, it's not displaying?
Yeah, it's swipe it.
Okay, thank you guys.
Swipe.
But then I can't see it. Oh, that's a bummer. Okay, well, all right. Okay, I'll try to figure this out. Yeah, I can go like this, I guess. Okay, so you're at genome.jp.japan.keg, and then basically we're going to go to pathway maps right here, and then we're going to go to usually, let's see, let's just go to KEGG overview. Let's see. You know what? I'm just going to type in. So you can type in the pathway you're interested in, it'll come up. And then what's really cool about it, so where's the click? Pathway map, okay. Is it'll show you the whole thing. And what you're looking at is you'll have basically a compound that you can click on. This stands for the enzyme, and it's actually the specific nomenclature for enzymes, and it's called the EC number with the class of enzyme. This, every time you see a circle, it's a product, but you'll have a whole pathway. And what's really cool too is you can actually overlay the organism. So for glycolysis, actually it's highly conserved. So you're going to see this for every organism. But for specialized metabolism, you can see, you know, does this plant have it? Does the fungus that colonizes the plant has it? How might they be interacting? You can use it for discovery. So if you go back, I wanted to go to the overview. Okay. So there's a full, yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is all of metabolism, and what I wanted to show you is that within this, and it might be hard for me to find here, so let's see if I can move it over. Basically, what you can do is, actually this will help. You can then highlight within all of metabolism what you're interested in. So we want glycolysis, and then it'll light up. Let's see if I can move this over. Whoops. Sorry, I feel like I'm a total spasm here. Okay, so maybe if I move it. Which one? There? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. So now it still doesn't show it. Basically what happens is that the pathway you're interested in will highlight. So if you're doing this, I would play with it for yourself because it starts to bring metabolism alive. And what you'll see, I'm gonna go back to the lecture, so I'm gonna get out of this, because I actually have a, oh, so now I can get my screen out again. All right. All right. This is, okay, where's my arrow? Okay, let's just close this. Okay. Okay, there we go. Oh my God. So what you're seeing here, what would highlight, so this is all of them. So basically when you look at this, every dot represents a compound, every line is a connection made by an enzymatic reaction, and then it's not just single pathways, but how they connect. And so when you hit glycolysis, you'll actually see that turn red. And one way to orient yourself, which we'll be seeing as we move on, is that that circle, right, is always the TCA cycle or citric acid cycle. And so you can get a feel for how things are connected, and then it's really cool to overlay it for different organisms. So we're only going to discuss the most central portions, and part of what I wanted to show you is that glycolysis, what we're learning today, and the reason I'm asking you to actually memorize every step is that it's central to every organism and to all of these pathways. And so we're going to start with catabolism, the degradation of glucose. So first we're going to look at the fates of glucose and then glycolysis today. And then we probably won't get to fermentation the last couple slides until next lecture. So the major pathways of utilization are 4. And what these are is that you can actually use glucose to build an extracellular matrix and cell wall polysaccharides, like, for example, cellulose, like plant cell wall material. You can use it for storage. So glycogen, starch, sucrose, which is a disaccharide, these are all, so glycogen and starch are polymers. So many of the glucose molecules, and then sucrose is just a disaccharide, so 2. And basically what happens with glycogen and starch in particular is that they don't contribute to the osmotic potential because they're a polymer, and so you can actually store a lot of them without having this really high osmotic potential, which is a problem for the cell in terms of potentially bursting or shrinking, depending upon if it's too low or too high. The other thing you can do is obviously, or maybe not, you can use glucose to make things. So one of the big things that you do is the pentose phosphate pathway to make ribose 5-phosphate for nucleic acids. We're going to spend time on that in a couple lectures. And oxidation via glycolysis, which we'll do today, to make pyruvate. So I have some notes to make sure I say that you can also use this conversion to sucrose, for example, for storage, And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that this oxidation generates, the complete oxidation, a lot of energy, right? So minus 2840 kilojoules per mole. The ribose biphosphate goes to nucleic acids and NADH. Remember, the nicotinamine is similar to the structure of nucleic acids, so made via the same precursors. And pyruvate goes to ATP and other specific amino acids. So what is glycolysis? So it stands for three things, which is sweet for the gly, and then lysis, which is splitting. So it's the splitting of sugar, right? And the reaction is glucose. We're going to go through it in detail, but basically glucose plus NAD plus 2 ATP, 2 ADP is going to pyruvate, and then ATP and NADH. So you're actually getting reduced form, which is a positive thing, and you're getting ATP out of this reaction. And you're making 2 C3 compounds from 1 C6. So there are 10 enzymes that are required for this to happen. These are highly conserved across organisms. They're all in the cytosol, and you want to know the structures and the enzymes. So I would just keep practicing them. You do not have to know how to push the electrons around and the arrows. So there are 2 phases. We'll walk through each one. This is just to orient you. The first phase is actually converting glucose to the 2 C3 carbons, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And in this case, you're actually putting in energy, right? You're putting in ATP. So this is often called the preparatory phase. And then the last phase, the second phase, is actually where you generate the energy. And you can see here you're generating 2 NADH, which is reductant, which is good. And then you're also generating ATP. So in terms of memorization, there are a couple of really useful diagrams which I put into the lectures from the textbook. And for this section, I think the textbook is actually very clear, and I'm sticking to it quite closely. So it doesn't have a lot of extraneous information. It's really quite clear. So the next, we're going to go through this first phase step by step. So we're going to look at reactions 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to move to the second phase. So reaction 1. So whenever you're starting a metabolic pathway, usually that first enzyme is rate limiting. What's rate limiting, or one of the rate limiting factors? Sometimes biochemists are getting away from that word rate limiting, but I'm still going to use it because just to show that it's critical in terms of regulation. Okay. So a couple things that drive glycolysis are how much glucose is there, and that's controlled by glucose transporters. And then one of the things that controls it. And then because glucose can be transported and moved around the cell, this enzyme is very important because it phosphorylates it, so it puts on this phosphate group. And once it has the phosphate on it, it's not readily transported. So now it's stuck in the cytosol, and it's stuck, it can't move all around the cell, okay? So this hexokinase, whenever you see hexokinase, basically what you're doing, a kinase puts a phosphoryl group on something. And if you ever see phosphatase, it removes it. So kinases are almost always ATP dependent. And the other thing about them, because they're transferring this phosphoryl group, is that they often require magnesium. And the magnesium is actually coordinating with those phosphate groups, which are negatively charged, to facilitate the reaction. And you can see that the delta G is negative, right? So this is likely to proceed. So whenever you see the word kinase, there are at least 3. I think there were 3 in this group, in glycolysis. Basically, it's an enzyme that catalyzes the transfer of a terminal phosphoryl group to an acceptor. And then again, I'm just repeating what I'm saying, the magnesium shields the negative charge, makes it easier nucleophilic attack. We are not focusing on the exact mechanisms, but you can just know that the magnesium is actually shielding, right, the negative charge of the phosphate to make the reaction faster. And this should be irreversible and spontaneous under physiological conditions. And here too, right, I'm sure you all know this, but when I have one arrow, right, it's only going in one direction, whereas if you have two arrows, then it has the potential to be reversible. So one of the cool things about, that's very interesting about glucose utilization is that in cancer, this was noticed a long time ago, that you actually have this excess use of glucose. And we're going to see in a couple of slides later, or even next lecture, some of the reasons why. But basically, those cells are metabolically active, they're rapidly dividing, and they're also usually under oxidative stress, which makes them require a lot more glucose to do the reaction. And so one thing that scientists did to try to figure out basically if you had active cancer cells is to use this thing called positron emission tomography, or PET. And so in that case, what you need is something, a molecule like this. So this is just a fluorinated glucose, and you need it to be able to emit a positron. So these are highly unstable. So you can only do PET somewhere where you can actually make this kind of isotope. And for example, at the Lawrence Berkeley lab, you can do that, or at the hospitals where they're doing this kind of imaging. And then this could actually diffuse, and it can go throughout the body. But then once you phosphorylate it by the hexokinase, it's trapped. And then you know that basically glycolysis is happening, that there's a lot of glucose, and you can see exactly where it is in the body. So here you have like the CAT scan, and then here you have the image from PET, and then here you have false color to really figure out what's going on. And it also shows you, right, how demanding the brain is. So it's not that this person has brain cancer, it's just that the brain uses so much glucose. So in terms of our evolution, we really, really use a lot of energy and metabolism, particularly in the brain. The bladder is excreting the product, so again, that's not about cancer there, but what they had showed was that it was in the spine and in the liver. So when you leave Berkeley and you go out into the world and you're discovering things, you could look at this pathway, right, which is critical to cancer, and they're still coming up with new targets. There are currently three compounds that target hexokinase that are used at anti-cancer, and there are also targets for a number of the next enzymes that we're going to talk about. So your knowledge here is directly applicable to the real world. And for me, with plant microbe interaction, we actually are thinking about using PET to follow a needed host metabolite into the fungus. So what about the next reaction? So the next reaction is phosphohexosisomerase. So you added the phosphate group onto glucose to make glucose 6-phosphate, and then now you're isomerizing it, and you'll see there's a nicer picture of this in a couple of slides of why you need to do this, but basically you need to move the phosphate group around to add the next phosphate. So here, right, you've just switched, you've just had an isomerization, and so you're basically preparing this for another phosphate group. And it's reversible, as you can see. And the delta G, right, it's 1.7, so it's kind of right on the edge of either going in one direction or another, so you'll often see this kind of a delta G if something is reversible. And it'll depend on the concentration of the compounds in the cell. So to get it to go this direction, you have to pull the product away. You want to keep the product concentration low to keep things moving. Okay. So the third reaction is phosphofructokinase, or PFK1. And so in this case, right now we have this OH group here, where we need it to be able to add a phosphate. And the addition of the phosphate comes from ATP, and it requires magnesium. And so we're adding the phosphate. And this is called fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So we have two phosphates, one here and one here. And the convention is when you have this phosphate, the phosphates are in different positions in the molecule. When you have diphosphate, like ADP or ATP, they're in a row. So this is often considered, this is irreversible. Again, when you're putting in ATP, often it's irreversible. And it's often considered the first committed enzyme, even though hexokinase is also really the entry point. Actually, glucose 6-phosphate can go to some other things. And this enzyme really targets it only to go to pyruvate. So reaction 4 is the cleavage. So now you have your two phosphate groups here. We're going to go through the chemical logic, but you can do a nice cleavage reaction to separate these two. And you have dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And if you were to look at this, it would look like it really should not happen. But you'll see in a minute what facilitates it. So we're going to go to the next reaction. So what facilitates it is that you have dihydroxyacetone phosphate going to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So this is an isomerase, and so this is basically in equilibrium. So again, this delta G is very close to zero. It's in equilibrium. It's essentially very close to equilibrium. But what happens is that only this can be used in the next step, only glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So it's driving the whole reaction. So remember when we talked about delta G, right? We had that products over reactants. So if the products as part of it, so right, if the products are very low, you'll be driving the reaction. And in this case, and it's a lot of the case in metabolism, a part of the way you drive it is by getting rid of that product. If it sits around, that reaction might stop. There are two ways. One is to convert it to something else quickly. Another way is to transport it somewhere else. So this is quite a nice way of looking at it. It's in your book. So this is the chemical logic of the first part, the preparatory phase. So you first phosphorylate, right, the OH group on glucose, and now it's glucose 6-phosphate and it's in the cell. So if you're checking yourself, right, you can like write down, okay, what enzyme is that does it? What might regulate that? Then from there, right, you have to actually do an isomerization to get your OH on the end so that that can be phosphorylated. So you're isomerizing here, right? So now instead of having that, the double bond to O, right, you have your OH group, and you can then phosphorylate it. Now you have a phosphoryl group on both sides, which is actually necessary for the production of the two compounds that can isomerize and for the cleavage. So the cleavage occurs here, and you get the dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and you get the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. These two isomerize, they're going back and forth all the time, but we're pulling the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And so that's driving this whole thing. So these are priming reactions, and I'm going to move into the second part now. So we're starting here with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So reaction 6. So you're just going to be playing with these at home, like write them over and over, go through the chemical logic. Again, you don't have to be able to push the electrons, but you need to know the changes. Okay. So now we have glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and then we're converting it to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So again, Knowing the language of chemistry and biochemistry helps you a lot. If you want to think about what would this structure look like, you know now it has to have two phosphates, right? And you know they're not going to be next to each other. It's bis-phospho. And actually the 1,3 tells you where they are, okay? So you have a phosphate here and you have a phosphate here. And this is your only reaction, which is NAD plus dependent. You can see that this is not favorable, so it's coupled to the next reaction. So this is what we've been talking about of all these coupling where you have something, usually an ATP-driven phosphoryl group transfer that's coupled to a reaction that's unfavorable. Did I skip anything? No. So reaction 7 is a phosphoglycerate kinase. So again, whenever you have that kinase, right here, you're having the phosphate come in, and then you're adding, in this case, you're actually transferring the phosphate to ATP. So you're going from ADP to ATP. So this might be confusing to you. Why is this called a kinase? I thought it was going to be taking ATP and then giving me a phosphate. It's because it was named in the reverse reaction of what we're showing. So this is reversible, and if you go in this direction, right, you're adding ATP plus magnesium, putting on the phosphate, and taking it off of ATP. But in glycolysis, we're using it in the other direction. So if you know what a kinase is, right, adding a phosphate, using ATP to donate that phosphoryl group, you just have to know that sometimes we might be using it in the reverse direction, which is the case here. So in this case, right, the phosphate is going on to ATP from ADP, and it's coming off of our molecule 1,3 bis-phosphoglycerate to 3-phosphoglycerate. So there's another cool thing that happens in metabolism. If you think about like something in a solution, like putting in a little drop of dye, like you're going to do Easter eggs or something, and the dye diffuses, right? And that's just diffusion limited. That's the same thing that happens in cells, unless you have a channel. So in this case, and in a lot of metabolic reactions, you'll actually have channeling. And so instead of having a product, here we have this product diffuse slowly to the next enzyme, we actually have a channel. So the enzymes are like this, and they're like literally passing it through a channel. And Judith Quinlan in chemistry was actually one of the people that discovered channels and was really able to actually see them under electron micrographs. They literally look like a channel. It's very cool. And this really speeds up the reaction, because here this is just, okay, how often based on temperature and other physical factors is that molecule going to hit the next enzyme. And in this case, it's literally being like going into a channel and moving into the next enzyme. So you avoid diffusion to speed it up, and you end up getting, this nice negative delta G. So the two values here are for the two reactions, right? For the G3P dehydrogenase and the phosphoglycerate kinase. Reaction 8. So now we're going to take the 3-phosphoglycerate. You can see this one's reversible, and basically we're now moving it onto this position, onto the 2 position instead of the 3 position. So 1, 2, 3 phosphate, and then here it's 1, 2 phosphoglycerate. Okay. So knowing that ordering from your basic chemistry, did you go over it in the first part of class again? No? How many people know how to count in a molecule? Okay, so if you don't, I would ask your GSIs to go over it with you and also look it up. I'm not sure if it's the beginning of this textbook, but usually at the beginning of a chemistry book, they would have this. So the final reaction, or not final, almost final, is 2-phosphoglycerate here going to phosphoenolpyruvate. So here you're forming a double bond and water is coming off. So whenever you have a dehydratization, water is coming off. And so here you're getting the formation of this double bond. You can see that this is not positive, so this will be coupled to something that is, it's not negative, so it'll be coupled to something that is negative to drive it. We're going to go through the chemical logic in a minute. So reaction 10, the last one, you have the phosphate group and you have ADP, and then now what you're going to do is you're going to have a pyruvate kinase. You're going to remove that phosphoryl group. It's going to go to ATP, and you're left with pyruvate. Okay? So again, this is a kinase, but it's acting in the reverse direction of what we initially talked about. So one of the reasons, you might actually think that this would not be that favorable, but one of the reasons it's so favorable is that pyruvate, so there are a lot of, there's additional levels of understanding for these types of reactions. And so one of them is the chemical level. So for pyruvate, this is the enol form, and this is the keto form. Usually, depends who you are, but often you'll see it drawn this way, like you see here. But the thing is, it can go back and forth. And because of that, you actually have a stabilization. And so it makes it more favorable. So if you're looking at a reaction diagram, right, where you have delta G, you usually have an activation energy, and then you come down to the products. Because those two are so stable, it actually makes this more favorable. You guys did reaction diagrams in the first part of course? What? Like activation energy is going up and then down. So let's look at the chemical logic. So starting from reaction, we have glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Remember that was the one that was isomerized, but it's the only one being used, so it's pulling it forward. And this is called the payoff phase, because I told you that in glycolysis we're actually making ATP and reductant. And so initially we put in ATP, but now this is where we make it. So the first part, you have the oxidative phosphorylation. So you have that happening here to make 1,3-bisphosphate, right? So you have the 2 phosphate groups on either side, one at position 1 and one at position 3. 1, 2, 3, the 2 positions. And then you have this transfer of the phosphoryl group where you remove that phosphate to get 3-phosphoglycerate. And then that moves from the 3 to the 2 positions to get 2-phosphoglycerate. Then you get the dehydration happening here. You form that double bond, and then you remove the phosphate group to get pyruvate. So if you look at this here, right, you're getting 1, 2 ATPs for every glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. If you start from glucose, right, you would then have 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates or 4 ATP. But in the first part, we put in 2 ATPs, the prep phase. So your net is 2. So we'll look at this here. So you have the prep phase, 1 ATP, 2 ATP. Then you have 2 of these molecules to get to pyruvate. That's why there's a 2 here. And so you end up making 2 NADH, 2 ATP, and 2 ATP. So 4 minus 2 would be 2. So your net is 2 ATP and 2 NADH. So just, practice going through this yourselves. And you need to know each of these steps for the exam. So Let's try the eye clicker again.
I hope you.
So it's on AA, if you haven't set it to AA.
Oh, one more.
Oh, yeah.
So, 2, 4, 6.
6. Yeah. There's 3 of them.
So you can discuss, right? Argue, discuss.
You got this, homie. Today I used one of my clicker days.
What are you thinking?
I think it's 6.
Where?
What?
On this or just?
No, because there's 3 of them. There's 3 glucoses in maltodextrose. So you generate 2 ATP in each glucose, right? So 2, 4, 6.
Okay.
I don't know. I can't. Just saying that's what I
Did you
thought.
forget yours?
Yeah, my clicker. Go back to NST 103. I didn't see Ian.
Everyone have it? Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
no.
All right.
It's a lot of reading. I have to look at that.
Ooh, okay.
What is it?
So you guys
Oh,
are
I could have gotten that point.
So, like we said, there's a net of 2 ATP per 1 molecule of
That's the way she
glucose.
words it.
And I gave
She put
you
moles,
a
and I was like-
disaccharide, so that would be 3 glucoses, so 3 times 2 is 6. So, good job, and I'll see you on